All right, now that we're all raked, fed, and watered, let's move on to our last panel. The end of the empire. First speakers are Mátyás Erdély and Thomas Rohringer, who will speak about administrative reform debates in Austria and Hungary, 1890 to 1914. Mátyás and Thomas, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Dash and Alexander, for organizing this great workshop and for having us. And thank you to all those who are already here from early Monday morning and those who are still here late on Sunday evening. Somehow Alexander's sunlight in his stream helps for me. The fruitful goal of this workshop was to go beyond the state apparatus. And with our paper, we want to pose the question, which state we talk about when we want to go beyond the state. Between 1890 and 1914, politicians, civil servants, legal professionals, and intellectuals in both halves of the Austro-Hungarian Empire engaged in an intense debate on the administration and its relation to the population of the dualist state created by the 1867 Compromise. They seemed to agree on one principle: public administration could not cope with the new challenges that it faced and was in dire need of reform. What kind of reform was, of course, a matter of significant discussion, both among reformers and in the public. Public administration was dealt with independently and internally in Imperial Austria and Hungary. But these years of reflection on the tasks, structure, and functioning of administration, we argue, offer a new perspective on the relevance of Austria-Hungary beyond its constituent parts. Our presentation is divided into two parts. First, I will give a brief overview over our research puzzle and hypothesis and our conceptual approach. Then Mátyás will substantiate our hypothesis with preliminary empirical findings on common problematizations in administrative reform debates and common perspectives of administrative reformers in Austria-Hungary. In the conclusion, Mátyás will then highlight the interplay of entanglement and disentanglement by engaging with the peculiar challenge we face, namely how the two groups of reformers were connected to each other, or rather not connected. There currently exist two narratives about the dual monarchy. The recent revisionist historiography has successfully challenged the narrative that the Habsburg Empire was inevitably failing because of its multinational population. It has, however, brought forth a new narrative on Austria-Hungary, namely that after the compromise, Cis and Transleitania developed into two different forms of statehood. Earlier studies like H.A.P. Taylor's The Habsburg Monarchy acknowledged the differences between the Austrian and the Hungarian half of the empire. However, they treated them as variations of the same underlying problem, nationalism. By contrast, more recent studies highlight how differently governments in Imperial Austria and Royal Hungary dealt with nationalist movements and their nationalizing populations. This is most clearly visible in Peter Judson's treatment of the question whether Austria-Hungary constituted an empire, in response to which he argued that Hungary developed into a nation state, while Imperial Austria became a rare example of institutionalized pluralism. In a similar vein, Benno Gamal argues that two distinct administrative logics developed in Cis and Transleitania on how to deal with both citizens and immigrants. On the one hand, recognizing national difference and maintaining a neutral position for the state in Cisleitania, and on the other hand, an ethno-national definition of social belonging in Transleitania. Rather than shades of the same problem, Imperial Austria and Hungary appear to have taken different paths and evolved into two distinct states only held together by the institutional framework of dualism. Cultural historians, on the other hand, have highlighted the flows and transfers that interconnected Central Europe. Going beyond the limits of Austria-Hungary, Moritz Csáky argues to look at Central Europe as a communicative space. Similarly, Philipp Thaer has highlighted transfers and trends of Europeanization in opera in Central Europe. Writing on Austria-Hungary and the establishment of museums in the dual monarchy in particular, Matthew Rampley argued that the empire constituted a shared cultural space. Similarly, studies on architecture or higher education highlighted the flows and transfers of people and concepts within the monarchy. And lastly, as several presentations during this workshop have demonstrated, there is considerable work showing entanglement on a personal level through the imperial biographies and multiple loyalties of the civil servants themselves. These approaches, of course, do not deny that hierarchies and unequal power relations existed in the region. In fact, Philippe Thaer, for example, argued that cultural policy constituted a new, more secular way for empires to gain legitimacy. Nonetheless, these two strands of research tell two stories of the dual monarchy, one of increasing divergence in terms of state building, and another of entanglement in the realm of culture in the broader sense. What we aim to do is to use the debates on administrative reform to bring these two approaches into a fruitful dialogue with each other in order to tease out what space Austria-Hungary occupied besides its constituent parts. For this purpose, we want to employ already established concepts of transnational history. First, our starting point was the observation that, as Mátyás will demonstrate in more detail, despite the different administrative structures of Imperial Austria and Hungary, administrative reformers offered both similar diagnoses and as a diagnosis of and solutions for what they saw as the ills of public administration. With Christoph Conrad, we could call these diagnoses traveling problems. These can be grouped into two problems. One, the issue of autonomy and strengthening the role of the central state. And two, the problem of bringing the state closer to the population with the territorial reorganization of the administration as a possible solution for both problems. Secondly, and building on this observation, we propose to investigate the circulation of models and mobile experts. As Mátyás will explain, administrative reformers in both Imperial Austria and Hungary looked at the same foreign states to identify possible solutions for the problems at home. Preconceptions of progress, modern statehood, and good administration directed their gaze and attention towards certain states, but not others. For example, the German states, and particularly Prussia, loomed large on reformers' mental map. And while we would argue that these preliminary observations call into question the narrative that Imperial Austria and Hungary had diverged along two distinct paths of statehood, in our conclusion, we engage with a peculiar gap that we have come across. Despite these commonalities, transfers between the Cis and Translatanian administrative reformers were predominantly unilateral. Hungarian reformers engaged with the reform attempts in Imperial Austria, but not vice versa. We engage with this challenge in our conclusion, sketching out further steps of investigation of where to locate further vectors of intra-imperial transfers. And with that, I am handing over to Mátyás.
So thank you, Thomas. In the empirical part of this paper, we aim to create a dialogue between the two parts of the dual monarchy based on, first, the common problematizations and potential solutions offered to these problems, and secondly, based on the common perspectives of administrative reformers in the Habsburg monarchy, as Thomas already mentioned. So let's begin with the common problematizations and solutions. In the present discussion, we only focus on the period between 1900 and 1914 and highlight two themes in discussions about administrative reforms. The first one concerns the question of autonomy in local and municipal administration, including the question of delegating specific tasks to lower level administration. These problems were sometimes treated under the catchword centralization, decentralization, and nationalization. The second problematization was the need to bring the administration closer to life, as reformers framed it. As a response to these problems, reformers proposed territorial reorganization as a possible solution. There are different tropes that come up here, such as the envisaged establishment of Kreise in Cisleithania and the reform of counties in Hungary. The problem of autonomy and the possible solution of reorganization connected two dimensions of administrative reform. First, the practices, and second, the politics of administration. They concern themselves on the one hand with administrative personnel, structures, qualifications and costs, filing systems, and routines. The goal was, as Josef Redlich put it, succinctly formulated, to make in Austria a cheaper, better, more efficient administration. But they also discussed the interface between politics and administration, the functions and tasks of the central state administration. Cisleitanian administrative reformers treated these two arrays of problems, so practices and politics, not as neatly separated, but as highly entangled challenges for an efficient administration. These two themes also existed in Hungarian discourses, though they were more neatly separated after the turn of the century. The debate, for instance, around the simplification of public administration that aimed at establishing more efficient, better, and cheaper administrative practices was markedly separated from the real, so-called real reform of public administration. The latter referred to the politics of administration, a debate that dealt with the same structural issues from the 1860s onward, and that included the reorganization of counties and the nationalization of public administration. In Cisleitania, a particularly important issue became the parallel structures and division of competencies between state, provincial, and municipal administration, resulting from provincial and municipal autonomy. While Cisleitanian administrative reformers acknowledged autonomy's historical role and significance, for them it had turned into something harmful. For example, in 1908, Josef Redlich emphasized in a talk that municipal autonomy, and I quote here, has guaranteed the Austrian peoples a large piece of sphere of life, free from state interference, and thereby prevented the most serious clashes among the nations and between them and the state, which would have been most dangerous for Austria's development. But 5 years later, Redlich declared that despite its historical advantages, the negative effects of autonomy had become prevalent. Not only had autonomy resulted in a lack of state oversight, it had also allowed partisan and nationalist politics to seep into provincial and municipal policy and administrative practices. In a similar vein, in the decades after the 1867 compromise, parliamentary legislation gradually reduced the autonomy of Hungarian counties and took away many of their previous tasks and functions. Amongst other things, it included the creation of the State Engineer Office, the establishment of a National Police Corps, the State Veterinary Office, taking away the management of the cash desk and bookkeeping from the counties, and finally entrusting the Lord Lieutenant with the right of appointing several senior officials in county administration. This tendency culminated in a piece of legislation in 1891 declaring that public administration, and here I quote, in the counties represented a state function. This was not uncontroversial, and many perceived the curtailment of county autonomy, as I just mentioned, so just enlisted, as a potential threat to the whole of the Hungarian political nation. Cisleitanian reformers imagined to solve the problem of autonomy through the territorial reorganization of state administration and shifting competencies from the autonomous to the state administration. Additionally, administrative reformers hoped that creating administrative units with clear linguistic, so to say, national majorities would reduce nationalist strife and unburden Cisleitanian politics, courts, and the administration from solving nationalist conflicts. At the same time, this reorganization was supposed to bring the central state administration closer to the populace by making the lowest level, the political districts, smaller and creating an additional intermediary level between the district and the provincial level. And it would be the Kreise. Furthermore, the territorial reorganization was supposed to be accompanied by a change in personal structures, shifting paperwork to subordinate clerks, and allowing more direct contact between top officials at the local level and the population. For Hungarian reformers, a recurring issue was also to bring the administration closer to life. And one solution was to recognize the counties into more balanced territorial units in terms of territory and population, or possibly to create a completely new territorial structure overlooking the traditional setting of the noble county. A significant difference between Cisleithania and Transleithania could be found at this instance, as the latter solution was considered a phantasm by most and was never seriously taken into account by the parliament or the political elite in Hungary. The noble county as the core organizational unit remained untouchable in the period under scrutiny. And now let's turn to the common perspectives of administrative reformers. Cis and Transleithanian reformers were connected by transnational knowledge transfers as they looked for possible models and solutions in the same foreign states, showcasing similar ideas of progress and shared conceptions of good administration. In this regard, it is fruitful, however, to distinguish between intellectual interest on the one hand and concrete initiatives for exchange. They appear differently in these reform debates. Certainly, administrative reformers from Austria-Hungary were interested in the laws, judicial and administrative structures of other states. Monographs, journal articles, and reviews manifested this interest and further facilitated intellectual exchange across borders and languages. And on the PowerPoint, you can see one of those examples. These contexts give an insight into administrative reformers' mental maps as they aimed at providing models of administrative structures and practices that could be transferred to Cis or Transleithania. Cisleithanian administrative reformers particularly fostered exchange with German states. When drawing up his bureau, Erich von Kielmansegg sent a district commissioner on a study trip to Prussia. When the Ministry for the Interior started to plan for setting up a commission for administrative reform, they considered English, French, Prussian, and Italian models for such commissions. But informal contact was established only with the Prussian government to receive additional practical advice. Reform initiatives in Hungary readily looked at foreign examples, especially in the German cultural sphere, which also provided the role model for legislation in Hungary on manifold occasions after 1867. Three countries, England, France, and Germany, played a prominent role in reform debates besides the closely knit Austrian case. The references of an István Weiss, a prominent figure in administrative reform debates after the 1910s, would be, and here I tell you a list, Heinrich von Kaiserling, Alois Kutt, Robert Puttkamer, Robert Hudegreis, and so forth from Germany, Kielmansegg, Brockhausen, and Ludwig Reneville from Austria, and Georges Davene, Georges de Martial from France. In this context, absences of transnational transfers are as revealing as their existence, since administrative reformers' attention was not equally directed at all states, not even at all other empires on a global or European level. Switzerland, as a partly Germanophone neighbor with a multinational population and a federalist structure, was as absent in Cisleithanian administrative reform debates as were the Russian and Ottoman empires. Cisleithanian reformers were also less concerned with the integrated federalism of the German Empire and more interested in the administrative structure of the German provinces, mainly Prussia, of course. These absences underline that administrative reformers in Imperial Austria were not looking for models of balancing the relationship between central state and provinces, but for how to build an administration that reached down to the local level and could incorporate many tasks of the autonomous administration. There was also an unwillingness to implement foreign practices in the specific conditions of the Hungarian kingdom, for instance. England, France, and Prussia served as examples to demonstrate the inevitable retreat of centralization, even in the most centralized European states, or to argue in favor of the very principles of autonomous local administration. And just to give you an example of this attitude, I quote Gyula Éhen, one participant in these debates, who writes, "Public administration can only be good and serve its goals if it is in harmony with the genius of the nation and serves the national ideals." Now, I will turn to our conclusions, preliminary conclusions. Administrative reformers in Imperial Austria and Hungary shared concepts and points of reference for refashioning their respective administrations. These connections, however, do not serve to gloss over the dissimilarities between the two halves of the empire. We do not argue that the two constituent parts of the empire were converging. Instead, we aim to nuance both the narrative of divergence and the concept of a shared cultural space in Austria-Hungary. The empire we aimed to show was held together by more than the legal and institutional framework of dualism. And despite their dissimilarities, administrative reformers in Imperial Austria and Hungary shared a set of concepts and models for improving public administration that bridged the diverging processes of state building. Yet, we can also not easily describe them as entanglement. Indeed, the commonalities between the administrative reform debates make one difference even more visible. Strikingly, Cisleitinian administrative reformers seldomly engaged with the reform efforts in Hungary. By contrast, Hungarian administrative reformers constantly looked at legislation and debates in Cisleitania, notably at the work of the Reform Commission. Entanglement and disentanglement therefore coexisted in the reform debates. And we had a preliminary hypothesis for that, but I will skip that one and finish with that sentence. Thank you for your attention. And we are happy to hear your questions.